In this episode of the Toolbox, we're going to take a look at one of the new up-and-coming frameworks that rewires your mind and, like Tailwind CSS, lets you do everything inside the HTML file. I've got lots of Toolbox shorts plus some GitHub tips, and I'll let you take a look at a peek at what I'm working on right now. It's going to be a jam-packed episode. It's Wednesday, September 15th, and this is episode 7. So let's get tooling. Hey everyone, this is Ravi Jalobos, and I stream about front-end and full-stack tools every Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern and 10 a.m. Pacific. So follow me, like, and subscribe on all the social media things for a lot more content. Now, if you want to watch any past episodes, make sure you check out my blog, rabo.org. I've got them in LinkedIn as well as on my YouTube channel. So let's get started with a lot of stuff. Now, I usually start off with a thing called Toolbox Shorts, and these are new tools and articles that I think you should probably know about, just basically stuff that I find really cool. So let's get into some of the tools this week. Now, the first one is going to be this thing called draw.io. So let me show you that on my screen. Let's go ahead and share here. So the URL for this is going to be either apps.diagram.net or just share.io. And when you do that, you will get an intro that looks something like what I had a second ago. It might be taking a while. Let's check it out. So it's really a diagramming sort of framework or online application. So weeks ago, I found this really cool, Mac and iPad app called Flowchart Designer 3. And I was really excited because I'd been looking for one for a long time. So now I found a new one, and it's actually called draw.io. And I feel like a fool because this one is so good that I think it's going to make me not want to use the other one. Although I do think that Flowchart Designer is nice if you want to use something on the iPad or if you want to do something offline. I think this one, as far as I know, it's just an online tool, although I'll show you that there is a VS Code extension. So maybe that's something that you can use offline. So you start off by seeing something like this, and you can you can sort of decide where you want to store the files. I'm just going to click on decide later, and you get into a diagramming tool that is pretty much like what I showed you a few weeks ago in Flowchart Designer. So you essentially, you grab one of these things, you can double click on them, and then you can type in something in here. And then from here, you can add another item right next to it and just keep on typing in, let's see, about, so say if you're doing like a website, you could do something like this. I do wish there were some shortcuts, and maybe I just don't know enough about the application yet, but you can sort of align things, and it does a really good job of keeping track of where you move things. And you can move things together. You've got lots of colors and styles and fonts. This is like unbelievably amazing, and that you could just get to it on the web for free. And as a matter of fact, as I mentioned, there is a Visual Studio Code extension for it. So you can actually look for this in the Visual Studio Code marketplace and find this so that you can just do things directly from VS Code. I feel like the less I get away from VS Code, the better for me. So you can just install it into Visual Studio Code. And notice that it lets you work with specific sort of, proprietary extensions, or it also allows you to do SVGs or PNGs. SVGs is usually what I do on the web. It also does let you do PDFs. So this is pretty amazing. And it's now going to be the thing that I use for creating my different sort of charts and graphs and stuff. So pretty awesome. So you can actually use also diagrams.net. Now, if you're wondering about the links to everything, I'll have all the links and on my website. I usually write a blog post that goes along with each one of these shows. And you can find the blog posts. We'll have all the links that you need. So don't worry if you don't see a link, you'll see them by just going into the post. So rabo.org, by the way. All right, let's take a look at another pretty interesting tool that I found. And this one's going to be something called Front Matter. So Front Matter is a CMS or content management system, but it's not specific for any particular platform. So it isn't like a WordPress CMS that you have to use WordPress in order to use it. You can actually install this, and I'm using 11T for my blog, but you can use this with something like Hugo, Hexo, Jekyll, Next, Gatsby, and just about any other one. Essentially, what it does is it lets you manage the files in your blog, and it gives you a few tools. So let me see if I can fire up Visual Studio Code, and let's see. And I'm going to open up my blog here. So here's what my blog normally looks like. I believe I have this extension installed, so you can see that because I have it installed already, it's actually giving me all these features right here. The one thing I like the most about it is that you can actually search for anything. So if you want to look for articles that you wrote on Bootstrap, then you could just type it in here and it gives you all the articles. There's a couple of different views that it gives you. I haven't figured out how to turn on the images, but I know that it does work with the images. I think it has to do with the way that I do images on my site. So the way that I have my, my images sort of named are hero and thumb, that might not be what it recognizes. So I might have to be changing that. And then in addition to that, of course, in the command palette, it gives you a lot of additional options here. So let's see, hero, what is it called now? Front Matter. So Front Matter. So you can take a look at the dashboard, and it can actually help you write some of the code in your blog post. So you can insert, for example, the current date, last modified date, or any start working with tags. It also allows you to manage your tags. So if you're using, some sort of blog engine like 11T, this is actually going to be perhaps a good CMS for you to try that lets you have some of the features that perhaps something like WordPress would have without having to go with that separate content management system. So that I thought was pretty cool. All right, next up, I've been talking about this alternative markup language for presentations, and it's essentially an engine. So they actually call this an engine, and it now also comes with a Visual Studio Code extension. So you can actually create presentations directly from Visual Studio Code, which means that this is going to also work with Code Spaces. So this is pretty cool. You can just install this like you would any other Visual Studio Code extension, and it's part of this thing called the MARP ecosystem. So the advantages here is that it's based on Common Mark. So Common Mark is a pretty modern version of Markdown. So all the latest features, and it has these built-in directives and extended syntax. So if you take a look at some of the options here, it allows you by default to use front matter like you would in something like YAML. So by doing that, it lets you assign templates, pagination, and all kinds of other directives that you add. And you can do something directly also into code. So notice you can add in an HTML comment. So remember Markdown, in Markdown, you can write HTML. And so it's just going to take an HTML comment and convert it into, a slide essentially. So you can see lots of cool examples on how you do this in here. The big advantage is that they just added this Visual Studio Code extension. And again, that makes you able to create these things in something like Code Spaces or Github.dev. So if you're going into a presentation, you can very quickly create that using this engine. It's pretty easy to use. I'm not sure how much customization it has. It does have like a plugin engine. I have my own thing at reveal.tech. So mine is based on Reveal.js, and it does a couple of other useful things that, I don't know that this framework has specifically. It lets you have a sidebar menu with some content so that you can go to different presentations. Definitely something I would love to see in this new MARP framework, um, and so for the meantime, I'm still going to use my own, but I really like some of the features and some of the simplicity. What I did with Reveal was essentially modify the way Reveal.js works. So it's not the, it's not the, um, it's not the sort of speediest. It's a little bit older, but it's really fantastic. So if you've taken any of my courses, you know that I put like a lot of my slides with this engine. So if you go to like, let's see, rabo.org, and then you go slides, say Tailwind, I have a version of this that lets you go through and take a look at my different slides, right? And the slides are just content. The nice thing is that I also created this additional feature using 11T that lets you look at the notes that I use whenever I'm doing a course. And now that means that you can take a look at all my notes and use it sort of as a reference. And all these have links to like practice environments and code pens and things like that. So it's a really good system. So MARP isn't going to be a solution for me quite yet, but I really do like where it's going because it's sort of taking just the markdown part of Reveal.js and it's creating an engine. There's actually a CLI that helps you create presentations pretty quickly. So definitely keep an eye out on that one. I don't know, at some point you may hear that I've gone nuts and convert it into MARP from Reveal. I don't know. All right. There's a really cool article that, let's see, where am I? So there's a really cool article that Jonathan Carter, who's a developer at GitHub/Microsoft, created. And this is fun things you can do with GitHub.dev. This is pretty interesting because when you get, if you go to any repo now, you can hit the period and the period will open up a code space. So essentially a copy of Visual Studio Code in your browser, and that will let you play around with whatever code is on screen. The really interesting thing is that you can actually do that not just on any repo, but on any specific file. And one tip that he gives you here is that you can actually do something called sharing deep links. So sharing deep links means that you can go ahead and select some text in a GitHub file, and then it'll open up a code space with that section of code selected already, which is pretty awesome. And that means that you can send somebody, a Visual Studio Code environment with some text already selected, and perhaps you can ask somebody to comment or pair code or do whatever it is that you can, because the GitHub.dev is Visual Studio Code just on a browser. A lot more stuff that you can do with it. So there's some other stuff that you can do, like reviews on pull requests, and that means that you can send somebody. So the nice thing about pull requests is that they show you diffs, so you can see sort of if somebody's proposing a change in your code, you can see what that change is. So you can send somebody a pull request review information. You can add things like the draw IO extension, which I just showed you, but you can also add any sort of custom editor. So there's like a Luna Paint extension you can add to edit PNGs or any sort of other graphics. And so this is a really good article. There's also some extensions that he's written in addition that are pretty neat. Code Tour kind of puts things on top of your, let's see if I can play it here without a sound. So Code Tour just lets you put sort of notes on your code so that it'll give them a little bit of text to let people walk through the code. I think it's pretty cool. I mean, I'm explaining everything to you, but if I was going to do some documentation, this might be a really cool way of doing it. And there's also, a way to do code snippets. There's lots of cool stuff in this article, so make sure you check that out. Let's see. All right, so this morning I blogged about a search engine for Git Ignore files. I'll be talking a little bit about Git Ignore in just a minute, but a lot of times, so a Git Ignore file is a file in Git that allows you to hide certain things from when you push content onto your repo. So whenever you're done with a commit, you can push it, but you don't want to push all the files. For example, like the Mac OS creates a lot of invisible files, like the DS store files. If you're working and perhaps you have like a build folder or a dev folder, that's not a folder that you want to push. So we add that to the Git Ignore. What this does is lets you go ahead and type in maybe your operating system, and then it lets you create, or it gives you a sample of a Git Ignore file that you may want to use. So a little bit about Git Ignore, more about Git Ignore in just a minute. Let's see if there's any questions. I see, like, I'm looking at this corner of my eye and I see a lot of activities. So that's always good. I really appreciate you guys commenting and doing things. So let's go. So let's see. Hello, everyone. Namaste also. Can everyone hear? It looks like nobody's complaining. So that's great. People are enjoying the intro. Thank you very much. I found this super cool piece of music, and I got it from Envato. It took me a while to get YouTube to stop complaining because I did have a license for it, but there's a little bit of a process to get that done. And it looks like my cousin is here. Hello, Dilian. My cousin from Texas. That's awesome. Let's see. First time in a live event here on LinkedIn. Is this a direct streaming from LinkedIn, or is it being streamed? So I am using StreamYard to stream this. So it's going from me to StreamYard, and then it's going, I'm simulcasting to YouTube, Twitch, and of course LinkedIn. So you may want to check some of the other streams for better quality. So yeah, Draw IO, super nice. And you can download it to your computer. That's great. I didn't know that. So I don't need to look for any other sort of files in the future. And that's fantastic. And good to know. Good to see your helping here. So hello, how's everyone? Let's see, would you mind posting? Yeah, so don't forget that the links are going to be on rabo.org. Usually by the end of the day, I just haven't found like a sort of cool, quick way of doing overlays. I know there's a way of doing overlays, but with everything else, trust me, I am working up to like the last 15 seconds before the show just to get everything ready. So I think in the future, maybe I'll be able to like afford or have a producer that can help me with things. So yeah, that's cool. I don't have any other questions, but good to hear from everyone. So next up, I have some Git tips. I mentioned Git Ignore files and that Git Ignore sort of search engine. They're super useful files. You can actually do something that's called creating a global version using a command called git config. That's one of those things that everybody uses when you first install Git. It asks you to set up your default username and email, and then you sort of forget about it. There's actually quite a lot of cool things that you can do with it. So I've got a little demo to show you sort of the things that you can do with, Git and some of the shortcuts as well. If you're a developer who uses Git, especially on a Mac, the operating system creates invisible files like DS Store to keep track of file operations. Now, the same thing happens in an NPM project, which creates a node modules folder. To prevent that from happening, you can create a Git Ignore file. Now this is going to tell Git not to send those files to your repo when you push things. You can also create a global version of that file so that it ignores files in all of your new projects automatically. I'm going to go ahead and edit this using the code command. If you don't have it installed, you can use the command palette and type in shell, and you should see a command that says shell command install code command and path. Once you do that, you can go ahead and open this up in Visual Studio Code using that code command. I'll keep it simple by adding just the node modules as well as the DS store file, but you can put whatever you want in here. Let's go ahead and save the file. Now that we have this file, we can modify Git's globals using the Git core variable. That's going to allow us to specify the exclude file option and point that to the location of the file we just created. Now when we initialize a repo, it will use our defaults to ignore files in the future. There are lots of config variables that you can change. A pretty common one is to change the default branch name from master to main. By the way, you can do this on a case-by-case basis by using this command. If you want to shorten that, just add the -b option and the name of the branch when you create the repo. This will work in versions of Git that are 2.28 and newer. You can find out which versions of Git you have by using git --" version. So Git Ignore, super useful. You can add a lot of things in there that will help you get things, make your life a lot quicker. So one of the things that I put in there is, for example, the ability to set the all kinds of other things. So I don't know if you guys use git config to create any Git Ignore files. So there's a lot of other customizations that you can do. Let me share a link with you. So I was like trying to type in links while the demo was going on. So let me show you. Yeah, so this file right here, or this document, let's see if we can make it really huge. Whoa, that's way too big. All right, so this sort of file here shows you like all the different syntax for adding things and all the types of things that you can add in there. So some of the other things that I've seen use, for example, let's see if we can go to a terminal, right? And let's see. So you can do a git config. Oops, I'm sorry, I can't type. Git config list if you want to see all of the ones that you have set up. You can also do git config global core editor. That will let you choose. So you could, if you really wanted to have some fun, you could switch it to VI. So you can switch your editor so that whenever you do any sort of commands in GitHub, then you would get essentially whatever default editor you choose here. You can also, this is a pretty cool one. I like, oops, I'm sorry. If you do, you can do a configuration for your autocorrect. And what this will do is it'll try to help you when you're typing in Git commands to autocomplete. I think you have to have a Git folder initialized. And then you can specify, like one thing that I use it for is for specifying my default diffing tool. So you can do like a git diff tool, and this will launch whatever your default diff tool is. I use something called Kaleidoscope that I love quite a bit. It's $70, so it's not cheap, but I really like using that. And so you can also specify something other than like the terminal for managing your diffs or managing your merges, which I think is pretty cool. So, okay, let's see, what do I have next? So let me know also, like if you use git config and you have some other cool commands that you like, or some other GitHub tips, I'd love to always hear them in the comments. So yeah, I think somebody is mentioning, let's see, so let's go back. Somebody says here, so Peter's always here, that's great. Let's see if I can pull up some of these comments. So here's something that keeps coming up for me: robots.txt and sitemap. What would be the optimal content for both? So robots is a file that Google uses to sort of, yeah, and the sitemap is the same thing. Those are two files that Google uses to sort of track your site. I don't really know how useful they are currently. I know that they've been around for a long time, so I don't know what, how much Google Analytics uses those, but, they're good to add in there. I haven't touched them in quite a while. Yeah, the latter is the same thing. As a sitemap is essentially just a map of the things that you want Google to index. You can ask Google to look at only certain parts of your website. So that's what the sitemap is for. I think it's usually like sitemap.xml, and you can usually have your engine like automatically write it for you. So that's that. Let's see if we have any other questions. So I think that is true. The Next.js default Git Ignore file is pretty good. But I really do like I really get annoyed when I forget to create a Git Ignore file, and then I end up pushing like a DS store or even like a build tool. So just having a global one is pretty helpful. However, you may still want to include one with the project, so that if you've got some other tools in there, you can prevent other people from messing up, adding their own DS store or other files in there. So does it improve search results? I can't. Yeah, that's tricky. I think it used to at some point. I don't know if they still use it quite a bit, but it could. Google does some black magic, and like every other huge company, they changed the way that they're tracking things. If you remember, I think I mentioned last week that they're redoing the way that headlines are sort of structured, so that it's no longer reading the really humongous headlines that people, or the titles that people put. It's actually doing page analysis and AI to look at the content, and it's sometimes generating headlines from your content as opposed to the big, huge keyword laden sort of headlines that people type in. So that's pretty awesome. So I wanted to show you a look at one of the projects that I'm working on soon. It's something called JSL, JavaScript as a second language. And I'm going to show you a little bit of a project that I'm doing for one of the videos. So JSL is my approach, or something I'm excited about, and I'm going to give you some more peeks later on. But it's essentially the approach I have at doing, how I'm doing a course on teaching JavaScript as a second language. I learned English as a second language. And I know that in learning that, I realized that for me, the most important thing is to understand not just concepts, but concepts in context. And that's what this thing tries to do. So let me show you that. I wanted to give you a sneak peek into something that I'm working on, and that's a project called JavaScript as a second language. In that course, I'm creating a series of videos, and each video happens to be on a JavaScript topic, and I'm showing you how they work by context, which is how I learned English as a second language. So I created this example to explain something called nullish coalescing operator. It's this operator right here. I'm using a technique here called the short circuit, which is pretty common, but you may have seen it with the OR operator. When JavaScript evaluates the statement, if the part on the left of the OR is true, then it doesn't need to evaluate the second part. And that's because if either of these statements is true, then the whole thing is true. And as a matter of fact, JavaScript doesn't evaluate the right side of the equation if the first part is true. There's no need to do that. Now you can use the short circuit to create a default value, and that's exactly what I'm doing right here. This technique is fantastic, but the logical OR operator has a problem. It will execute the right-hand side of the equation if the left-hand side has any falsy value. So if llama ID happens to be null or undefined, it would return a random image, which is what I want. Except for when I went to initialize the llamas right here, I want to pass the index of the first item, which will be this image right here. The problem is that when I'm passing 0, it interprets that as a false value, because when working with Booleans, 0 means false and 1 means true. That's what the nullish coalescing operator is there to fix. If I change this back to question mark, notice that it is showing me the plain llama. It only changes when I hit the switch button right here. Now, if I had the logical OR here, as I did before, it would sometimes give me a random llama. It will always execute the right-hand side of the operation, even if I use 0 as the index for llama ID. And that's what this whole series is about. It's showing you how these things work in a context of building something like an app. It also tries to be a lot of fun, and that's why I'm using llamas. So there it is. It's a little piece of what I'm doing. The actual, I don't know if you saw sort of the video that I showed earlier with the original prototype that I did for this. So I'm going through and doing about 15 of them, and they have the same kind of style, something sort of fun. This one uses llamas, and I've done some other ones that use different animals like cats and stuff. So I'm really having a good time with it, and just wanted to show you kind of some of the idea is to build something that's realistic in context. That way, I think you kind of understand the concept a little bit better. So last week, I showed you a new CSS framework called Assembler CSS. Actually, before I do that, let me answer a question. So yeah, there's actually here, imagine sending sensitive information about Angular environments file and later finding out that it wasn't added to Git Ignore and reversing it isn't straightforward. I know what you mean. You have to clear the important thing when doing that is making sure that if you update the Git Ignore file, that you clear your cache right after you do that. So there's some commands that you can do. I can look for them later on, or you can just Google like clear cache Git. There's a specific command that you can type and that'll clear your cache, because sometimes even if you update the Git Ignore file, it doesn't sort of know that it's been updated. And then in terms of editing the Git Ignore file and pushing it, that can create problems as well on your repo. So one of the things that you can do is uh, do sort of rewrite the history, and that brings me to my latest course. So what a plug this is. So I actually created a course recently called Learning Git and GitHub. It's a new version of a course that I had done a long time ago, and it goes through. It has a cool intro. It's doing pretty well. It's actually like, wow, almost 10,000 people already learning it. But I go through. There's a video right here on ignoring files, and so make sure you take a look at that if you can, and that'll show you what you need to do. But there's also a section here on changing history. So what you can do is if you've ever submitted a password before, which I know I have, you can actually change the entire history of the project by using an interactive rebase. So in this video, I show you how to do that. And there's also another one that I did called GitHub Code Challenges. So you can take a look at it on the library. And this one is kind of has like a gamey kind of feel to it. The interesting thing is that there is a video here called Fix a Committed Password. I feel you. I've done things that I needed to fix. So this kind of shows you a crazy way of taking care of that if you ever run into those sort of problems. I do listen to a lot of feedback. So if you have anything that you want me to do, I'd love to do some segments and answer questions on that. But thankfully, this particular question I had already answered, so I'm glad I can point you to some resources, Samula. All right, so let's get into the main sort of event. As I mentioned last week, I showed you a new CSS framework called Assembler CSS, which I think is where CSS platforms might be going in the future. Let me check on time really quick. Oh, got plenty of time. And as I traveled the web, I stumbled over this other framework called Alpine.js. So let's take a look at Alpine. And so this is sort of a new lightweight framework, and it is sort of kind of ridiculous. And I wanted to show it to you. That was the big tease of the episode. What new framework should you learn? I really love this one because it is so simple. I love simplicity. That's why I like, so far, my favorite framework happens to be Vue Js, because you immediately get Vue Js. It just makes sense like almost immediately. And I think Alpine, when you first read it, you're like, what the heck is this saying? So there's a bunch of really interesting things about this framework. The killer feature is the simplicity, looks weird when you first look at it. So you can see that there's this X data thing, and this looks like there's JavaScript in the HTML. How can this possibly be valid? But the simplicity is what the selling point is. So you can see here that it has 15 attributes, 6 properties, and 2 methods. So there's very little that you have to learn to sort of get good at this framework. And I'll go over some of these things, but here's all the different sort of directives. And a directive is nothing more than a command, but there's very few of them that you'll have to learn. So the other very, very weird thing is that, like Tailwind CSS, you end up not doing anything in the JavaScript file. I know that's crazy. That is really weird. So I want to show you kind of a demo of how this works. I'm going to switch over to Visual Studio Code. And let's see, right now it's got my my project here for my blog. So I need to finish up the article. And let me look for, so I created this swing. So if you watch the previous sort of episodes, you'll know that a swing is a Visual Studio Code extension that lets you create a file that is essentially like a live preview. So notice that I can type things in here. So if you want to check it out, make sure you you can take a look at the, what is it, the activity bar. Yeah, so in the activity bar you can look for code swing and install that. It's really, really cool. It's sort of like having your own code pen within Visual Studio Code. And remember, because you have the ability of creating these at github.dev, you can create really cool demos pretty quick. So this file consists of this code swing.json, and you can add different, essentially you can add different libraries. And here I'm adding Alpine as well as Bootstrap, just the CSS version of Bootstrap. So once you begin to like begin this, you do code swing, and you can either just start one. You can add it in a directory, which is what I've done here, so that I have a folder to look at. And then you do add library, and you can add a script or a CSS file. And then in here, once you add the scripts, then it'll actually write this code swing.json file. So let's take a look at this index.html. We can actually not worry about this code swing. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually bring up the Alpine website side by side so we can take a look at the docs and have an idea. So in Mac OS, I just go over this green bar here, and I'm going to tile this to the right. And actually, I should have picked the other one when I did that. Let me do that again. So I'm going to go over here, tile this to the right, and then click on this one. That way it'll appear side by side. And so it's Alpine.js.dev. So here's the, the site, and as well as my swing. And let me go ahead, and I don't really need anything else in here. So I'm going to hide some of the other things. And status bar, nope, I probably wanted the status bar. Activity bar is what I wanted. Okay, so here I'm going to start working with this framework and show you some of these different properties. It has pretty good documentation, but I want to show you some of these things right here. The basic tag that you add is essentially an X data. So X data identifies what it is that you want to do, what it is that you want controlled by this framework. So you start the segment of your page. So this can actually work with other frameworks. And it's sort of a little bit like jQuery and Vue Js. In Vue and even, Tailwind, you can actually just add a script file. Not something you want to do in Tailwind because it's a humongous file. But we can create a div here. My dog just walked in. He always loves to barge in. This door does not lock. So there he goes. He looks to check up on me. So what you do is you can create a div and then create use this X data attribute, not XD. And then in here, you can put in an object. So here we can say something like name, and then in quotes, and I want to do single quotes here. I think you might be able to be hearing my dog here in the background. right? So you with this, so an interesting thing about X attributes is that an X data wrapper is what you call a directive in some of these frameworks. With this directive, you're actually creating state in your file. So with the state, that means that you can, create some content that uses that state. So we can say something like H1 will create an H1 here and here. This is what you normally do in something like Vue Js or React, but with this framework, you say X text, and then you type in the name of the variable that you want to use here. So let's go ahead and add some classes here. So we'll add a container class, and then we'll add a margin top of, I don't know, 4, just to move it down a little bit. So you can see that by adding this X text directive, I can actually call a variable that I'm using in my application. And that's what this first one is. So it's a container for the entire application, as well as a way to specify state. And this state is just an object that you can put whatever else you want on. So that is pretty cool, sort of like Vue.js, but I didn't have to create a separate JavaScript file. I didn't have to create a script section. I just did it directly in the HTML, which is sort of the crazy thing about this framework, but then also the cool thing. So X text, let's see, you can also add additional. So this doesn't have, this is just an object, so you can add whatever you want. So let's add another one here called count, and we'll initialize that to 0 at the beginning, and then we can add maybe a button. So let's see, so underneath, so this X data has the entire application with this current state, although you can specify if you want to, like a global state. So this is going to be a button. And what we can do, if you want to do events, you use the X on directive, right? And then you use this click option. So you just type in the name of the event, and then you can, if you want to, let's go ahead and close this button, right? And in here, we can say, that we want to also have this display our count. Right, so now we have a counter. When you click on it, it advances. So just a simple counter here. That's pretty cool. And again, we're doing all this just in the HTML. I'm making it look pretty with Bootstrap, but this is just valid HTML that now has a bunch of code for managing an application. So that's pretty cool. Let's see. Let's try, I'm going to show you some code. Let's see how well I'm doing on time and take a look at the questions here. So let's see, there's a couple questions. How is Ember? Ember, I think, is what LinkedIn uses. I haven't used it ever. For some reason, it's the one framework that I missed. And then I decided to go work at the company that uses it. So yeah, I have no real idea on what Ember is like. So I'm sure there's maybe LinkedIn people watching that will be able to tell me. But I really love this one. So let's just keep on going with this one. So what I can do is let's go ahead and add that count. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to modify my button, and I'm going to add some additional components here. So let's say that I wanted to create a list of items. So in addition to this, I can just create an array right here, right? And this array can just have, let's go ahead and initialize it with an element, right? And what we can do is go ahead, I'm going to add an unordered list here with a class of list group, right? And then in here, what you can do if you want to add the sort of results of a list is use the template tag. Now, this is interesting. The template tag is a valid HTML tag, and what it does is let you create a piece of content that doesn't show up on the browser normally. So it doesn't show up in the browser by default. So let's see, for item and list. So what we will have then is a series of, in this template, we can create a list item that has a class of list group item. And for X text, we'll type in the item here. So we created a list. And it looks like something's not right in my application. So let's check this out. So I have my list of items. I needed to put a comma here. So you can now see that my list has an item in it, and I can type in some other items here. Let's see. Oh, look at, it's actually giving me a list of suggested things. So you can see that I can very easily build a list of items, and now I have this count right here. I can make this a little bit more interesting, and I have some code that I've sort of done here. So I'm gonna paste some code. I don't usually like to do that, but this live coding is really sort of tough. So let me show you that I'm going to modify my data, because the data itself can also have methods. So in addition to having things like this, you can actually create a method and then do something within the method. So if we wanted to create a to-do like list, we could create an item or a method called add here that will take something and push it to the list ourselves. So if we wanted to add something, we just add it with JavaScript directly in the HTML, which, as I mentioned, is pretty weird, but that's the kind of thing that you can do with this framework. And then what I'm going to do is I'll add another element called current that will just initialize as nothing. And then I'm going to modify my my input field, and I'm just going to grab some code here to show you what it does. So instead of just having this button here, I'm going to add some code that has a slightly different version. So what I've done here is I have added, using the same sort of concept, I created a pill that right now is keeping track of the count, right? Or it's actually keeping track of how many of these items. And notice as I'm hitting add, it's actually adding one here. Now you can do two-way data binding. So let me just hit a space so that you can do two-way data binding in here by modifying this input field and adding this X model property or directive. So this X model directive allows it to keep track of whatever is in the current variable, which we initialized here. That means that whatever I type in here will get added automatically to my list, because it's tracking it with this two-way data binding. And this just reminds me a little bit of the way that Vue Js works, but then also really the way that Angular 1 would work. And you can see in the documentation that there is a tons of other properties here. So if you want to do something like class, different classes depending on the types of values of certain elements, you use this X bind, and then you can put in a ternary statement here that shows you, different classes depending on some logic. We already saw the X on directive, which is how you do events. The X text directive, which lets you go ahead and type in some text within the context of the HTML property there. You can set the this is pretty cool. This is like how you do a partial. I've often wanted to do, have like a header or a footer and a file, and it's relatively hard to do just with plain JavaScript. Even with something like Vue Js, it doesn't kind of have a partial sort of statement, but this framework comes already with a pretty sweet partial. that lets you just load something into a segment of code here. Then we saw the two-way data binding with X model. You can also toggle elements with X show. This is how you animate things with X transition. We saw the X4. Of course, there's conditionals with X if. This is, you can run some code when the item first loads. And let's see, I'm not sure. I haven't used X effect quite yet. So I guess execute a script each time one of its dependencies change. So this is sort of like, how you do effects in React, and this xref. So sometimes you need to be able to grab things from the current page. So you can create a reference to an element, and it's just almost like accessing the DOM. So this xref would let you access an element in the DOM. You can also use xcloak to hide certain things, and also just completely have a segment of your code that doesn't have any logic be ignored by Tailwind. So that's it. That's the entire that's the entire framework. And if you've used something like Vue Js, you're probably going, yeah, you know what? I could do this thing. It's going to be weird for you to try to get used to not doing things in JavaScript. That was, I think, a pretty big struggle. Uh, my dog's back in the room, so forgive me. That was a little bit of a struggle to remember to try to do everything within the HTML page, but it was very freeing and it's so easy to use that I found it pretty easy to get used to, especially since I've done React and I've done Vue. I think if you come from Vue.js and maybe if you've used Tailwind, it's going to help you get used to a little bit of the funkiness. So let's take a look at, hopefully that gives you a little bit of a taste. I'm really enjoying it. For really quick projects, it might be the thing to do. Definitely very simple. So I'm going to probably spend a little bit more time on it. Let me know if you think that you might want a full course on this. We always like to hear from people. And let's see if I have um, any more comments. It's really good to see Peter here. Looks like he's like a regular now. So I can, let's see, it's kind of like I'm kind of going off CSS libraries as they clash with any JS or jQuery animations. I'm not sure I quite understand that question. Maybe it came from something before. Yeah. Okay, so I actually probably need to back up. Understand the syntax. I'm shaky on practical implementations of JS. Yeah, the syntax is, I mean, that's the thing about Vue.js, that the way I liked it over React was that I immediately sort of got it. And I think that it takes a little bit of time to be able to read it. But once you read it, just things become really easy. I mean, a to-do application in just a few lines of code within the HTML, not having to go to the JavaScript file, I think is pretty cool. So let's see. So yeah, I bootstrap. Yeah, I use Bootstrap. I would have used Tailwind, but in Tailwind you have to do like so much code for just the button that in this case I think just in this kind of demo I think just using Bootstrap, just the CSS, made it a lot simpler. Can you use a third-party BS mods? I haven't used any. I just haven't had the need to, since most of what I do is training. But I have looked at things like, yeah, Bootswatch, or I know that there's like a React version of Bootstrap. So if I was really doing things for production, I might look into those because they will make things a lot easier. Drag, let's see, any framework that will let me drag and drop controls, set their properties and code without having to deal. Interesting. So yeah, I think there are some things that will just read XML. I mean, without having to deal with HTML tags. I don't know how that would work. I do think that there are some things. I don't know that they make those for the web, but I don't know. If anybody has any ideas, I would love to hear. Yeah, good valuable session, maybe once a month. Ranga, I got something better for you. I'm trying to do these once a week. They are quite intense, so I don't know if I'll be able to do one every week, but I'm gonna keep trying. You might see some more of these later. So, all right. So let me go over some other things that I have going on. So as usual, I'll post an article on Rabo.org later on, hopefully today, and you can get all the links that you missed. You can take a look. I read a weekly newsletter that usually goes out on Thursdays. And this is the last sort of version of the newsletter. Every week I try to sort of retell you what I'm up to. And I usually put in some shorts in here and some other pieces of content. So this is one of the best ways of keeping track of what I'm up to. I have actually a new course. That just released today. And if you were here last week, you noticed that I did this sort of the best parts of Bootstrap 5, the new features of that framework. So this course shows you all the new features. So just if you want to know what is new in Bootstrap 5, then you can just watch this. And then I also, at the first two chapters, are pretty much about what is different and the things that you should watch out for when you're transitioning from the previous version of Bootstrap. I do not, I do not want to, like, if I had a huge Bootstrap site, it's going to be a struggle because of some of the things that they have done. Just makes things a little bit difficult to update. So watch the course. It's out and brand new, and I appreciate you guys being here. I don't think I have anything else. So you can watch these later on. They're all stored. So if you follow my YouTube channel, you can see them all stored in there, or you can go to rabo.org. So make sure that you follow me everywhere. And good seeing a lot of people interacting in the chat. So I'll see you next week.